and spent wild amounts of money. Where does the government get the money? No one cared. Because, well, they were right. In that, if you didn't do it, then the discussion about how to do it would be academic in the worst sense of the word. Who cares? You had to bail everybody. You had to get the system fixed. And the only thing they could think of was to go to the banking system, the financial system of America, and basically say, okay, you are no longer in charge here. We are going to provide every bit of money anybody needs from now on. We are going to guarantee the debts of all the major banks, which is what they did. We are going to give the banks the money that they couldn't borrow from anybody else so they can keep functioning. In that time, the United States government did something which, like the flat wages, we could not talk about as a nation because of the Cold War leftover of what can and cannot be said in polite conversation. The United States nationalized the financial system of the United States. Those banks became, and many of them still are, government-supported entities. We socialized. We did what we think socialism is. That's what we did. We socialized our... Well, I mean that. We poured money into every major bank. We gave them huge amounts of money. Your money. That's what we did. We guaranteed their debts, which not only commits the money we have now, but commits your children and grandchildren to take care of this. This is a debt that's open-ended. The largest insurance company, which had written insurance policies for every financial transaction that couldn't be made anymore, called the AIG Corporation, they announced that they couldn't make good on their insurance policies. And so the government took them over and still runs them. We've poured $200 billion into that corporation alone. It's 80% owned by the United States. That is a socialized insurance company, the biggest in the world. We took over General Motors, which we still subsidize on a massive bit, and so on. Everybody was agreed. There was no significant dissent anywhere. Anywhere. Where did the government get this money? Nobody cared. But we should have cared, because think a minute. There's really only three ways for a government ever to get money, to do anything. It either taxes people. That's one way to get it. But if you think Mr. Bush was low on popularity in the waning months of 2008, given everything what was happening, imagine the attitude towards the fellow if he had said, okay, we have to raise the money to bail everybody out, so every American family has to cough up another $18,000, which is roughly what it would have been. Poor Mr. Bush, he would have been lucky to make it out alive. That's why we can't finance our wars with taxes. We don't like them anyway. If we had to pay for them on top of fighting them, then the polls would be even more negative. But we don't do that. We do with credit. So the government couldn't tax. Didn't see any way it could do that. Okay, that leaves two ways. You can print the money. Governments love to do that, because that's quick and that's cheap. It's just the paper. It doesn't cost much. So there were temptations in the government, and for those of you that pay attention, we have been printing money, lots of it. But we couldn't do all of the need that way, because that would make the whole world worried about the dollar. And that's very dangerous for us, because the world uses the dollar the way it uses no other currency. Over the last 30 years that the United States has been playing this game of flat wages and rising productivity, the government has never had the courage to tax anywhere near enough to pay for what the government does. The mass of people don't want to pay taxes, and the rich don't want to pay taxes. And the corporation can't afford to alienate either of those two, so it kind of plays the game, okay, I'll do what you want, and you won't have to pay. I'll borrow. And over the last 30 years, we borrowed and borrowed and borrowed. And when the United States government borrows, it gets increasingly desperate to find somebody to lend. We are the world's biggest debtor, the United States. Nobody's even close. We're the biggest debtor country in the world. And you might enjoy, just thinking about it, you might enjoy knowing, in case you haven't heard, we're the biggest foreign creditors, because the United States, when it borrows abroad as well as at home. The People's Republic of China is the largest lender. So let me just help you see that you're in a new world. The number one capitalist country in the world is in debt for $1.5 trillion. That's what the debt is, to the number one communist country. I know many of you are fond of that American pastime, second only to baseball, of celebrating how wonderful we are and how terrible the communists are. Think about it. Might be worth a moment's thought what it might mean, this situation. But it means also, among all the other things, that we can't play around with the dollar because the rest of the world will be very angry with what they have, in this case the Chinese, and the number two country that we owe money to is Japan, that these two countries would be very upset with us if we unilaterally devalue what they hold their wealth in, namely in dollars. So we couldn't do that. So what was left was borrowing. Borrowing needs a word. Bear with me. We borrow. Besides borrowing from other countries, China and Japan, we also borrow, that is, our government borrows from Americans. You all know that because of many a day you've felt a knock on the door where you live, and there's an agent from the government saying, the government needs to borrow. Could you please lend us something? I'm trying humor here. That doesn't happen to you because you're not rich enough. I hate to tell it to you, but the government doesn't want to spend time with little people like you and me, get $18.14, not interesting. So they borrow big amounts of money. Who do they borrow from? Wealthy individuals and large corporations led by banks. Those are the major people that lend to the government. This leads you to a wonderful conclusion. Over the last 30 years, and especially in the last 3, the government of the United States doesn't tax corporations and rich people. That's what I'm going to finish with in a couple of minutes. It doesn't tax them. Instead, it goes to them and it says, lend me the money, which corporations and rich people can do because they didn't have to pay the taxes. The money they didn't give the government in taxes is what they lend to the government. And think of it as a rich person. This is something you do when you buy that lottery ticket, so you know how to do this. Imagine you're rich. You could be taxed by the government to cover a problem of the government. Then they come, take your money, say goodbye, and end of story. But they don't do that. They come instead and they say, give me the money, I won't tax it from you. Give it to me as a loan. I'll give it all back to you, and between now and when I give it back to you, I'll pay you interest too. If you were a wealthy individual or corporation, would you be against government borrowing? Yes, because Americans are easy in these areas to fool. The same politician and banker and corporate president who gets up on the appropriate days to give you a speech about the importance to living within our means, the government shouldn't be running deficits, has in his own portfolio lots of them because they're a very good investment. He's taken the money he hasn't paid in taxes and lent it to the government. The way you do that is to buy what's called treasury security, an IOU of the government. That's how it's done. So the people giving you the speeches about what shouldn't happen are the ones making money off the fact that it happens. And if that sounds to you as though it might be hypocritical, then I've been clear in my presentation. That's what it is. So now we come to the crisis. The government has spent all this money. It's borrowed all this money. It's broke. Listen to Governor Walker in Wisconsin. We're broke. Governor Kasich in Ohio. We're broke. Governor Cuomo in New York. There's no money. We have to lay off 4,000 teachers, and we have to open a nutrition program for pregnant women, and we have to. There's no money. Stop. What are you talking about? There's oodles of money. Money is the one thing we've generated for the last 30 years in wild profusion. What we haven't done is made sure that the government, to perform its normal functions, and especially its functions in a crisis to bail the system out, can tap that money in a reasonable way. So let's turn to the topic that Americans freak out about the most, taxes. Let's see whether there's money there and whether it's reasonable. Let's start with the federal government and then go to state governments and then on. Federal government. The biggest source of income for the federal government is the income tax. Everything else is small by comparison. There's two kinds of income tax, one on corporations and one on individuals. The income of a corporation is what we would normally call its profits, its net revenues. What's left over when you subtract the cost of doing business from the revenues you get from selling whatever the business is in business to produce. The United States government taxes that. It's considered a corporate income, and they have to pay an income tax. Just like you and I have to pay an income tax on our wages and our salaries and whatever other income that we have. Let's take a look at that. 50 years ago, the United States government got, ready, 50% more of its revenue from corporations' income tax than from individuals. In other words, corporations as a whole in America had to come up with 50% more than was taken from individuals. Corporations were the major support of the government's budget. What is the situation today? Corporations pay 1/4 of the amount that individuals pay. You understand the shift? That's not small, that's not little, that's not marginal, that's massive. The burden of the federal government has been taken off business steadily for 50 years and put on you. And on behalf of corporate America, thank you. Okay? Now let's take a look at the second thing. The big thing now is individual income tax, because the corporations have gotten out of it. When you heard Matt earlier say GE paid 2%, Goldman Sachs, or they get refunds, that's what you're tacking into. You're hearing, here are the particular examples of this enormous mega trend. Now let's look at the individual income tax. Same story. I tell you this only because my experience as a teacher of economics is that nobody knows this. In the 1960s and 70s, and there may even be some people here who paid income tax back then, so you'll remember. In the 1960s and 70s, I'll take one year as an example. 1970. In 1970, the top income tax bracket in the United States was 70%. Here's what that meant. If you were a single individual in 1970 in America, every dollar you earned over $100,000 a year, rich people obviously, every dollar over $100,000, ready? You had to give Uncle Sam 70 cents. You got to keep 30. Do you think that's high? In the previous 15 years before 1970, the rate was most of those years 91%. Ready? Every dollar over $100,000 that you earned as a rich income earner, you had to give the government 91 cents, and you kept 9. Why? Because we had just been through a catastrophic depression and then World War II. And in those situations, the argument in America was we all have to pull together, and those who have the most have to contribute the most. And I want to remind you, this 91% before 1970 and 70% in the 1970s was endorsed by Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, Republican Congresses and Democrats. Nobody said boo politically. It was a universally supported rule in the United States. I'm not talking about Russia or China or Cuba or anything. We took it from the rich people. That's what we did. What is the top rate of the income tax in the United States today? 35%. Okay? That's an income tax drop, ready, for the richest, from 91% in the 60s to 35% now. That is a tax cut. You have never seen anything like that. Nothing like that happened for the vast mass of the American people, not even close. So what do we have over 50 years? We have a massive shift of the burden of taxation at the federal level from corporations to individuals and from the richest to all of you. Social funds who got all that money dumped on us as a kind of economic tsunami, bailed out by the government with our money. Now we are going to be told we have to take fewer government services, watch our neighbors and friends who work for the government as teachers and social workers and firefighters and police officers, they all to lose their job. You've got to be kidding. In fact, as an outsider looking at this, it strikes me that if I were an advisor to the Republican Party, I'd tell them to be very careful here. You are pushing too far. You're going to get a backlash that you're going to be real sorry. As people's conditions keep deteriorating, which all of these programs make, for sure, where's that anger from all of that going to go? Over the last weekend in the Wall Street Journal, this last week, the Wall Street Journal has a weekend edition, covers Saturday and Sunday. So it would have been 26, 27 or something of March. There's a wonderful story on the inside that the Republican Party in Ohio is beginning to have second thoughts because their polls show voters are angry at them. Are angry at them because they see this now. They're beginning to get a sense that in a time of unemployment, laying off public employees will make the unemployment worse. And during a time of unemployment and people without homes, we need more government service and help, but you're reducing it. That doesn't sound so good. And what's supposed to happen? Wonderful, good things, but they're not happening to me. They're very dangerous for them. Not that I worry on their behalf all that much, but it is a sign that something, and the Wall Street Journal wanted to make a story, wanted us all to see that those Republicans are getting worried, and that's, I suspect, because the Wall is getting worried. And I think that that's a sign, too, of the very same things that we're all saying. Of course the money is there. We don't have a problem with taxation in the United States. We have a problem of who is taxed and who isn't. We are at the end of a 30-year period where the gap between rich and poor has become unbelievable. In the hands of the rich is concentrated an enormous resource that could and used to be made available to solve problems in this country. We have a national economic crisis. What better reason, what better historical precedent than now to go to where the wealth is so that it can help get us through? We're not doing that. And it is not happening on a scale that is so overwhelming that the really interesting question, which all my friends from Europe keep emailing, is what is happening in this country? What's the matter with you? What are you American? What's wrong with you? One example, because it offends me so deeply. There's a debate going on for weeks. Maybe watched it or gotten bored by it. Republican officials in Washington talking about they have to cut the budget by $66 billion. That's what the House, the Republicans are now control the House. And the House is in favor of a $66 billion cut. The Democrats, no, the Democrats control the Senate. The Senate only wants 33, 66 versus 33. Friends, the deficit is that's a $1.5 trillion debt. That's what's being borrowed from wealthy people here and from the peoples of China, putting this country further and further in debt. If you're dealing with a deficit of $1.5 trillion and your two major parties are debating 66 versus 33, that's like having a fight with the person trying to mug you, in which the issue is how many of the pennies in your shoes you will get. That's irrelevant. What the Democrats and Republicans are doing, they're counting on you all to think that 33 billion, that sounds like a lot, and 66 billion, that sort of sounds like a lot. And they're telling you, look, what is it? Important is both parties are perfectly happy to run a $1.5 trillion debt. They both agree on that. There's no dispute whatsoever. No debate about it. No discussion of who's going to get all of the interest payment on the money. You don't have to pay for that, to pay the interest to the people. You don't own those bonds. You just pay interest. Once you don't get taxed, they buy the bonds. That's what they do with that money that they don't pay taxes. By the way, all my rich friends, and I'm from consulting with corporations and so on, they all explain it. This American economy is too shaky, they say. I'm not going to invest in the United States economy. I found a good investment. I'm going to park my money in treasury securities. I'm going to take the money I don't pay in taxes and lend it to the government. That's what they're doing. And that's not a productive use of this. That's not to build our economy. That's for the government to use to keep things from collapsing further. So what you're watching in Washington is a game, a theater of the absurd, in which the two contenders aren't contending last point. And this is, if I leave you with this, you may get depressed, but then again, everything I've told you tonight might lead you there, but you'll see where. For 30 years, American corporations moved production out of the country. In the last 5 or 10 years, something new has happened, and that is really serious for us going forward. American corporations continue to move production abroad, but the new thing is, that's where they see their future markets growing. That's new. It means that American corporations have not only decided to produce out of the country, but that the growth, the future, where they should spend their money marketing, where they should spend their money for advertising, where they should plan on their growth is outside the United States too. What does that leave the United States? It leaves us with a set of corporations for whom the rest of us are decreasingly relevant and important. They're more interested in making sure that laws get passed in Europe or Asia or Africa or Latin America than those laws get passed. If the roads deteriorate here, it's less urgent than making sure there are good roads elsewhere so their trucks can travel. Their interest in this society is shrinking. And the American holiday of 150 years of rising wages, our empire, economic as well as political, has never in my lifetime seemed as shaky and the future as grim as it does now. The people in charge are making the money. They'll make the money abroad as well as they make it here. American icons like Pepsi-Cola already make more than half their profits outside the United States. They're an American corporation, but they know what they depend on, and they depend more on the rest of the world than they do on this society. And their politics and their ideology and their planning come from that. They're doing what they do. They're making a lot of money in China and everywhere else. And they're paying the dividends to the people rich enough to participate in the corporation. But it's leaving the mass of the American people more and more out of the loop. And that has more to say about the future of this country than anything else. Only the people here can stop that. If there isn't a change, if Matt Renner's comment of a tipping point, if that's not true, I hope it is, but if it isn't, then we're not going to see a major change. We're going to see more going down this road that has now been in effect for 30 years and hasn't even been derailed by a fantastic crisis that the whole world shook for a long time around. But I don't want to leave you with the thought that people aren't doing something. That's what we get back. Whether it's the story about Portugal I told you or the thing in Wisconsin. But the story I'm going to end with is about something that happened a while back, but that Americans don't know. And it's about Americans who made a difference. One state in the United States out of 50 made a decision early on in the crisis, early in 2009, not to do what California is doing, its neighboring state, not to do what Cuomo is doing here, not to do what Walker and Kasich and the others are doing. It's the state of Oregon, for those of you who don't know. In 2009, here's what happened. The legislature began considering a bill, and the bill went like this. We in Oregon are not going to do what our sister state, California to the south, Washington to the north, what they're doing. We are not going to cut public services. We're not going to lay off any public workers. They face the same problem every state did. With a crisis of unemployment, with a crisis of home foreclosures, the revenues coming to states collapse. Unemployed people don't pay income tax because they don't have an income. And people who are in a crisis cut back on expenditures because they're scared, and so they pay less sales tax, and that's what states depend on. So every state is in trouble. Every state is having less money. They could, of course, go to the corporations and the rich, but they don't. But Oregon is the exception. And I tell this story because it certainly must be true that if this could happen in Oregon, then it sure could happen lots of other places. It's summertime 2009. The legislature has a bill which says we're not going to cut services, we're not going to lay off all people. How are we going to deal with the cutback of our revenues? We're going to tax corporations and we're going to tax the rich. I kid you not. And they do that, and they want to tax everybody who earns over $250,000. Any family that earns over $250,000 a year has to pay a big increase, and any family that earns over $500,000 a year has to pay a whopping big increase. It passes the first house of the legislature. People are amazed. It passes the second house of the legislature. People are more amazed. The bill is sent to the governor, who signs it. In other states, that's the end of the story, but not in the West. In the West, they take seriously these ideas, we give lip service to democracy and all that. So in Oregon, like in other states, here's the law. If a group of people, it doesn't have to be very large, goes around and collects signatures, they can force any bill that has passed the legislature and been signed by the governor to be put up for a vote by the people as a whole. And the people decide. In other words, if the people vote against that bill, their will overwhelms the governor and the legislature. The bill is void, and I think they can't even allow to bring it up again for a year. So in other words, the people overrule the governor and the legislature. Okay, so you can imagine after the governor signed it, the Republicans and the business community went nuts, predictably, and they gathered the signatures very quickly. They were able to do that. And that required then a date to be set. I believe the date was the 10th of January, 2010. On that day, after months of campaigning by the two sides, 1.2 million people, citizens of Oregon, went to the polls. You know why I'm telling you the story. They voted decisively in favor of the law, so Oregon is not doing what the rest of the United States is doing. And if you don't know that story, then that's a lesson to you in how the media in this country work. You don't know. Even though nothing could be more relevant for all of you that are considering, for example, what the governor of the state of New York is now doing, nothing could be more relevant than the question, why aren't we doing, or at least debating doing, what Oregon did? Oregon is, in case you didn't know, part of the U.S. of A. And so it might be reasonable to take it as a model, or at least as an image, of what we could do. Even if there weren't an Oregon, we should be discussing it, but we actually have a place. When Americans get mobilized and clear that it's kind of gone too far and they want to make a basic change, they have shown themselves able to do that. It's scary. We have a long tradition of time when thinking like this and talking like this got you labeled with words I won't repeat because you all know them anyway. But what may surprise a lot of you is that those times are over, for better or for worse. And the best example is me, because I go all around the country talking like this. And instead of people looking at me funny and worrying that they're in the same room, they keep inviting me you very much for your attention. And now, as Matt explained, if you have comments, questions, expressions of outrage, there are mics. So if you do it that way at the mic, or you'll bring the mic around, and everybody can hear the question, or the comments, or the whatever.
Hi, Professor Wolf. I'm Jeannie Meyer. We met before. I have a couple of questions or comments. First is that I don't know if you know this, but at the time that productivity and wages uncoupled, so did the lowering of the ranks of unionized workers. And in fact, today, the level of people in private sector unions is lower than it was before the Wagner Act in 1935. It is lower, and I believe that part of the success in this creating the structural inequality has been an attack on labor unions and an attack on labor, and it should be mentioned. I'm sure you agree, but I also have been following this group called the Robin Hood Tax Group. I don't know if you know them, but they're talking about if you go to their website, robinhoodtax.org, there's a video of a baker being asked, why don't you go and pay a financial transactions tax? And they say, oh, how much would that be? And it goes down. He's basically like, oh, less than 1%. And how many would that make? It would be like hundreds of billions of pounds. Anyway, I think that I can't believe that nobody has raised this issue of a financial transactions tax, because I frankly think that it's the rich that got us into this, and that's where, if there's going to be revenue, it should be coming. So I'd like your view.
The numbers, for those of you that are interested, in the private sector of the United States, according to the United States Department of Labor, 6.9% of workers are in the union. So 93.1% of the workers in the private sector of the United States are not members of and are not bargained for by any trade union. So it's really crucial for you to understand that arguments about the danger or the cost or the burden of trade unions is silly. It's just a joke. The only amazing thing is the ability of the American people to take it seriously when the newspaper says it. Even in the public sector, which is much more organized, it's still below 1/3. So the vast majority of public employees are likewise ununionized. Unions in the United States are unspeakably small, poor, and weak. The idea that they represent a counterforce to corporations requires that you know nothing about what I just said, since it's an impossible argument to sustain given this situation. So, yeah, absolutely, trade unions have been on a 50-year slide. Here's even before the last 30 years, basically goes back to their high point in the mid-50s if you look at the numbers, and it's been going down ever since. It's a very sad story, to say the least. The importance of this, if I could just take a moment, we have three significant kinds of organizations speaking up for working people. By far the most important is the trade union movement. We had a wave of unionization in the depths of the Depression. I want to remind you of the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the CIO part of the AFL-CIO. The CIO swept across American industry in the 1930s, organizing unions and workers and trade unions, created an organizational framework. All those workers giving a little bit for their union dues. That's why this crisis is different from the 1930s. In 1933, a president, Roosevelt, who had been elected as a balanced budget conservative Democrat, coming from one of the richest and most established families in the United States. By the way, the unemployment in 1933 when he does this is 25%, 2.5 times. So goes on the radio and says, wonderful alternative, but for me and the federal government to do that, between 1934 and 1941, the federal government created and filled 1 million jobs. Now, why do I tell you this? We're in a crisis now, in this day, a very, very with millions of people out of work, or something part-time work, or being, displaced. No one debates it. The president never mentions it. It's as if it didn't happen in our country. Why is that? You don't have organizations that were forced to go along to do what those organizations were organizations, I told you. Trade unions were the biggest. But dare we say it, that the socialist result of the power of these organizations, we had two interesting things here in New York. Because we had it, an African American communist was elected to the way back then. Benjamin Davis. You never heard that? Go read up on it. It's in all the history books. The people of New York elected a black communist to the city council. And you think Americans can't do something unusual? That counts as unusual. That would count as unusual now, wouldn't it? And imagine it back then when Jim Crow and all that stuff was still part of our culture. So you had organizations, socialist, communist, all the trade unions, all of the communists and socialists have virtually disappeared. And the trade unions are on a 50-year slide. Of course we don't have the kind of pressure on our president to do what even a fellow like Roosevelt told to do, let alone to go further. So yeah, the story of the trade unions and how they got caught up in that is absolutely crucial.
I want to start by thanking you for singing my song and doing it in such an erudite way. But I'm really interested in what you think of the way of the unemployment situation, the jobs. There is a regardless of the financial situation, definitely an enormous loss of jobs due to the computerization of work. And I'm asking where, though they talk about new technologies creating jobs, but those two are highly computerized. Where do you think a high degree of employment will come from that will return America to a high employment economy?
Sure. Before I answer, there is something that I should say. I don't want to be understood as arguing that we ought to have this or that law, this or that. That regulation, this or that, change in the government. I could come up with them like I just did in terms of the government employing people. But frankly, I don't think those are sufficient. Something much more fundamental has to happen. In the 1930s, we did all those things. We put people to work. In case you don't know, and because it's part said to everybody who has any artistic skill, can you sing? Can you draw? Can you act? Can you sculpt? Do you read or write poetry? Didn't matter. Come and we'll give you a job. And here's what we'll do. We'll put you into troops, an acting troupe, a poetry troupe, creative writing troupe, whatever it was. And we will pay you to do your artwork, but to do it in a way where we'll move you all around the United States, particularly the cities and towns where they don't have an orchestra or poetry, so that the children and the adults can get culture. That was the greatest distribution of culture to the American people we had ever had before, and that we have ever had since. We were a creative people. We transformed the unemployment program into something that not only gave people a job, but transformed everybody else's life. That was what could happen if you had trade unions, socialists, and communists working with a government that responded. So what would we do to get this again? All of that was undone. All of that was undone. Just like the rules governing what banks could and couldn't do that were passed in the 30s were undone later. If we don't change the basic structure of this society, that's the message, then even when we have a crisis, we won't get the right response. And even if we get the right response, it won't be secure. It'll be undone by the same unequal organization in which masses of people produce what the profits are for a very small number. As long as you keep that situation that way, you can't be surprised if those with the wealth who keep collecting it make sure that they stay in that position by shaping the culture and shaping the politics. What can we do now? Here's some examples. There's a lot of people who understand that we are disorderly. Russ